My loving people, we have been persuaded by some that are careful of our safety to take heed how we commit ourselves to armed multitudes, for fear of treason. But I assure you I do not desire to live to distrust my faithful and loving people. Let tyrants fear. I have always so behaved myself that under God, I have placed my chief strength and safeguard in the loyal hearts and goodwill of my subjects. And therefore I am come amongst you, as you see at this time, not for my recreation and disport, but being resolved in the midst and heat of the battle to live or die amongst you all.
Welcome to the Significantly Trivial Podcast. I'm your host, Rome. Well, here we are. First episode, inaugural episode. And you're probably wondering, what is this podcast all about? Well, if you're like me, then you love trivia. And you're probably pretty good at it. I think I am. My friends and family hate playing games like Jeopardy or Trivial Pursuit with me because I always win. Well, almost always. People would always tell me, hey, you should try out to be a contestant. But some would say things like, it's just useless trivia. It doesn't make you smart. You know, dictionary.com defines trivial as of very little importance or value, insignificant. But is that really the case here? I don't think so. The human brain is very much a computer, and like computers, they all work differently. Some have very fast processors and can pull up information quickly, while others can store massive amounts of information and data. You know, it's funny, I joke that my hard drive is full, and that in order for me to learn new things, I have to delete other things in there and make room for the new stuff. But I'm rambling. So this podcast will shine some light on the trivial, and we'll dig deeper and find what makes it significant. You ready to get started? This episode will focus on a bit of trivia that, for some reason, is tattooed on my brain. It is etched in my memory forever. I mean, I could be on my deathbed, incontinent, forgotten everyone I know and love, but if someone asks me this question, that light bulb that's been off for years will switch on in an instant, and I'll blurt out the answer with enthusiasm. And it goes something like this. In 1588, this invincible fighting force was defeated in a decisive and pivotal battle by England. And the answer, of course, the Spanish Armada. Now, some of you may think you know the story, right? England's great triumph, the Protestant wind, which we'll get more into later, the dramatic end of Spain's naval dominance. But as we unpack the sources, we'll discover a far more complex and honestly, in some ways, an even more surprising account of what really happened and, well, just how precarious the situation was. Digging deeper, we'll discover a fascinating story full of nuances many of us, myself included, never knew or just simply forgot. Some of you might have recognized that speech at the beginning of the podcast. It was, of course, Elizabeth I addressing her troops at Tilbury, and it was meant to inspire confidence and loyalty in her soldiers and the English people. It really emphasized her commitment to the nation and her personal involvement in the defense of England, and helped strengthen her symbolic role as the nation's protector.
I have the heart of a king and of a king of England, too.
For centuries, the defeat of the Spanish Armada was recognized as one of the key turning points in the fate of Europe, and really the world. It was the symbol of English resolve against just overwhelming odds, a common theme throughout history. But the historical record actually reveals a much more layered truth about how truly pivotal it was, and perhaps more interestingly, what might have happened if just a few factors had played out differently. It's a classic case study, really. Strategy, cutting-edge naval tech for the time, flawed leadership, and yeah, a whole lot of unexpected turns. Okay, so let's set the stage here. We first need to grasp the geopolitical landscape at the time. It's the mid-16th century. Spain is undoubtedly the dominant power in the Western world, both on land and, of course, at sea. It had a huge empire spanning continents. Under the reign of the devoutly Catholic Philip II, it viewed itself as the primary defender of the Catholic faith. Philip's father, Charles V, was actually the Holy Roman Emperor for a time too. England, by comparison, was a much smaller nation, kind of an insular nation. Led by Elizabeth I, it was going through, or had gone through recently, a serious transformation. Growing pains. It was going through some growing pains, if you will. So what were the simmering tensions that set these two very different nations on a collision course to the brink of all-out war? Well, the causes were many and incredibly complex. It was a volatile brew of political ambition, military maneuvering, and especially these deep-seated religious divides. Europe at this time was in the midst of the Protestant Reformation, a religious, political, and cultural movement that you may remember started with Martin Luther and his 95 Theses, charges levied against the Catholic Church of its abuses and injustices. This one event, one man's simple complaint, sent shockwaves and created a religious upheaval that rippled through the European continent. And in an amazing stroke of luck, fate, coincidence, or whatever you want to call it, one of the key reasons this movement spread so quickly was because of the invention of the printing press a century earlier. It helped spread these Reformation ideas quickly and enabled the movement to challenge Catholicism's influence. Spain, and Philip II, being the champion and defender of the Catholic faith, did not take too kindly to all this. He considered Protestantism a dangerous heresy and saw it as a direct challenge to the authority of the papacy and Catholic monarchs. It was this religious schism that formed the bedrock of the animosity between the two nations.
We shall bring glory to Spain, and with God's help, crush these heretics.
What further stoked the fire was the complex political landscape at the time. Philip II had been married to Elizabeth's half-sister, Mary I, and actually held the title of King of England and Ireland during her reign through this union. It is important to remember that back then, royalty only mixed with royalty. Complex familial relationships were formed because of this. I mean, God forbid that royal blood mingled with that of peasants. Upon Mary I's death in 1558 and Elizabeth's ascension, Philip's influence in England waned, and thus Catholicism's influence. Elizabeth, for her part, wasn't just sitting idly by either. A Protestant through and through, she was actively subverting Catholic and Spanish influence not only in England, but elsewhere in Europe. In 1585, she signed the Treaty of Nonsuch, which formally committed English financial and military support to Protestant rebels fighting the Spanish in the Netherlands, which, by the way, was ruled by the Spanish Habsburgs, a branch of the Habsburg dynasty that ruled vast territories throughout Europe at the time. Spain wielded this power and influence not only in Europe, but overseas as well, through its many colonies, particularly in the Americas. Earlier in the century, Spanish conquistadors like Cortes and Pizarro conquered the empires of the Aztecs and Inca, plundering their wealth and resources and transporting it back to Spain. The treasures being ferried across the Atlantic by the Spanish merchant fleet was unsurpassed. This, however, put a huge target on their backs. Pirates roamed the high seas and the islands and coasts of the Americas, plundering ships and outposts. But along with these unsavory sailors were the English privateers, basically state-sponsored pirates, who were supported by none other than Elizabeth I. One such privateer was Sir Francis Drake. Yes, that Sir Francis Drake. The famous and legendary explorer was also a pirate. He became notorious for his raids on Spanish ships and settlements, all under the guise of exploration. So here was England openly poking and taunting the Spanish bull, challenging their imperial authority, their religious standing, and economic might. But it was one single event that pushed Philip over the edge and solidified his resolve to depose the heretic queen and put an end to English interference once and for all. In 1586, Mary, Queen of Scots, Catholic claimant to the throne of England, was arrested for treason and conspiracy to assassinate the Queen. And in 1587, she was executed. Her death, ordered by Elizabeth, was viewed by Philip as regicide, the killing of a king or queen, or in this case, an heir. It was now personal for Philip, and it became his own holy war, a crusade much like those centuries earlier.
I will make war upon England in such a manner that the very memory of their existence will be blotted out.
Philip decided that a full-scale invasion was the only way to end English interference and restore Catholicism in England. He even got Pope Sixtus's blessing and Rome's promise of significant financial support to help re-establish Catholicism and a Catholic monarchy in England. His plan? Well, it was ambitious, audacious to say the least. This enterprise of England truly was of biblical proportions and designed to just end England's defiance. The first part of the plan was to assemble a massive fleet, the likes of which no one has ever seen. This Grande y Felicisima Armada, the great and most fortunate navy, was to set sail from Lisbon, Portugal, up the English Channel to rendezvous with the Duke of Parma and his battle-hardened army in the Netherlands. This combined force would then cross the English Channel and invade England. It was estimated that this fleet consisted of over 130 ships. Leading the charge were the tall Spanish galleons of the Armada in the renowned crescent formation, designed to protect the smaller supply vessels and transports. It must have been a terrifying sight to behold. Aboard these ships were over 17,000 seasoned soldiers, 7,000 mariners, and a huge arsenal of 2,500 guns. And this wasn't even the main invasion force. That was coming from the 30,000-strong army waiting in the Netherlands. The plan seemed simple enough on paper, but incredibly complex in reality, and it seemed doomed from the start. First off, before the campaign even started, the admiral in charge of the Armada, the experienced and brilliant Don Álvaro de Bazan, tragically died of illness, most likely typhus, just before the campaign. His replacement, handpicked by Philip himself, was the Duke of Medina Sidonia. Alonso Pérez de Guzman was not a naval commander. In fact, he had zero military experience. He was an aristocrat, and most notably the great-great-grandson of Ferdinand II of Aragon, one of Spain's most beloved monarchs. Along with his queen Isabella I, they unified Spain and sponsored Christopher Columbus's voyage of discovery to the New World. So I'm not sure if this distant relationship played a part in his promotion. To his credit, Medina Sidonia possessed considerable administrative skills, and perhaps Philip was counting on this in order to pull off this grand plan. I don't know. He did reportedly confess to Philip that he felt unfit for the campaign and the command, and even expressed serious doubts about the whole campaign's viability. Add to this that some sources suggest that he would get terribly seasick at crucial moments. Not a good look for someone in charge of the grandest of fleets. Adding to this, a raid by Sir Francis Drake on the port city of Cadiz in 1587 destroyed a number of food and water crates and casks, depleting supplies and provisions, thus delaying the invasion nearly an entire year. So Spain was already facing an uphill battle before the first shots were even fired. Another challenge was the fact that vital communications back then took days. It's not like today. You couldn't just call or text the Duke of Parma and tell him, hey, we're running a little behind, BRT ASAP. So any messages or changes to the plan often never reached their destination in time. And I think perhaps this is why Philip chose Medina Sidonia to head the operation. He gambled that his administrative and organizational skills would overcome these early challenges. Well, it seemed that his gamble backfired. When it comes to commanding a force in actual combat, there is no substitute for actual hands-on experience, not to mention a strong stomach, neither of which Medina Sidonia had. This lack of experience meant he was often reactive, not proactive, struggling to adapt to the English challenge. The English were led by much more seasoned sailors. Lord Charles Howard, Sir Francis Drake, and John Hawkins, these were real sea dogs that knew, in order to win, they had to control and dictate the battle. And the fleet they assembled was designed to do just that.
I shall do my duty and get them as good a reception as they have given us.
Spain's navy was well known for their galleons, tall, massive, multi-decked and multi-masted floating behemoths. These were the battleships of their time, able to dish out large amounts of firepower and damage, but also able to take it. And this was their strategy. This was Spain's bread and butter. Engage, fire, and approach. And these galleons were sturdy enough to endure the damage long enough for them to come alongside and board the enemy ship with hundreds of sailors. The problem, though, with having such large floating fortresses is that they are very slow and difficult to maneuver. In addition, they are top-heavy and, due to their size, draw too much water and are susceptible to running aground. This will play a critical role later in the battle. The ships of the English Navy were designed for a different type of strategy. Under the guidance of naval innovator Sir John Hawkins, England developed a new type of vessel. Often called race-built galleons, these ships were longer, narrower, and sat lower in the water than their Spanish counterparts. They sacrificed sheer size and durability for speed, stability, and agility. This streamlined design allowed them to sail faster and closer to the wind, giving the English commanders far greater control over the engagement. Some even suggest that this design was inspired by the ancient Viking longships that terrorized English shores centuries earlier. The English commanders had no intention of engaging in close ship-to-ship combat. Their goal was to utilize their superior speed and maneuverability to keep their distance and hit the Spanish ships with heavy barrages of cannon fire. It's kind of like a boxing match. The English had a reach and speed advantage, so naturally they would use their jab until they find an opening and hit them with a hard right hook, then use their speed to get out. Spain was the brawler, trying to get to the inside and then start pummeling away until you get knocked out. This battle symbolized a profound shift, a technological and tactical revolution in naval warfare. Anyways, back to the plan, back to the invasion. So here's this massive Spanish fleet sailing up the English Channel, banners waving, sails unfurled, and they're in their famous crescent formation. I mean, it really must have been a sight to behold. It was a huge flex. The Armada, however, had no intention of engaging in battle, yet. The plan was to continue up the channel to rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's army. Well, on July 19th, the English sighted the Spanish fleet. And the English, for their part, must have known that this wasn't the invasion force, either because the Spanish were not in an attack formation but a defensive one, or they were tipped off, I don't know. Either way, the Spanish fleet continued their way north, but the English seized the advantage and engaged them in a series of skirmishes. Mostly meant to harass and disrupt and also show off and test their prowess, the English managed to damage and capture 2 Spanish galleons, the San Salvador and Señora del Rosario. But still, the Spanish formation proved incredibly difficult to actually break up, and it continued its slow, steady journey up the channel. With the English tailing them and harassing the rear of the formation, a fatal flaw in the plan soon revealed itself. The coast of northern France and the Netherlands is notorious for its shallow and rocky shores. This prevented the Armada's larger ships, the galleons, from getting close enough to shore where Parma's transport ships were waiting to ferry the reinforcements to the fleet. And it wasn't smooth sailing for the Duke of Parma's forces either. A disciplined Dutch fleet under the command of Justin Nassau effectively blockaded Parma's army in the Flemish ports. Parma couldn't even reach the rendezvous point. They were essentially pinned down. It was quite the cluster for Spain. You have these 2 massive Catholic forces, the Armada and Parma's army, so close but yet so far, pardon the cliché. Separating them was just a few miles of shallow water and a determined Dutch fleet. I'm sure Medina Sidonia was sick to his stomach at this point. The Armada really had no choice but to drop anchor and wait for Parma's forces to break through the blockade. This left the Armada very exposed and vulnerable. The English knew exactly where they were too, after having dispatched scout ships. They maybe didn't know what was happening though, and why the Spanish were just anchored, waiting. But they didn't hesitate and seized the opportunity. On the night of August 8th, under cover of darkness, the English sent 8 burning ships sailing towards the tightly anchored Spanish fleet off Calais. In what would be called the Battle of Gravelines, and one of the more well-known details of the battle, the English ordered old vessels to be packed with anything combustible, pitch, gunpowder, tar, and be dispatched in the direction of the Spanish fleet. Can you imagine the sight of burning ships in the dead of night heading in your direction? These hellburners caused massive panic in the fleet. Spanish captains and commanders, in fear of their own powder stores igniting from the fires, ordered their ships to cut anchor and scatter. The next day, the English, seeing the Spanish fleet in disarray, pressed the advantage and ordered an all-out attack. Now reinforced and emboldened by the success of their fireships, they closed in on the scattered and disorganized Spanish fleet. They learned, too, from their earlier skirmishes, instead of aiming high for their masts and sails, they now aimed lower towards their hulls and the waterline, inflicting significant damage. Spain was caught flat-footed and suffered heavy casualties, with some of their ships sunk or run aground. The Spanish, quite remarkably, however, managed to regroup and fought back bravely. This was a real testament to their seamanship, even with the odds no longer in their favor. It soon became apparent, though, that this was a no-win situation for the Spanish. With heavy casualties and their supplies dwindling, but most importantly, the realization that Parma's army was not making the rendezvous, the commander of the Armada, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, made the hard call to abandon the invasion entirely and head back to Spain.
I find myself adrift on an ocean of disaster, unable to regain control.
But with the English navy in the way and a strong wind blowing from the southwest, their only option was a desperate one, and would be a fateful decision. They were to sail north around the top of Scotland, then down past Ireland, and try to get back to Spain via the vast, unforgiving Atlantic. And this is where nature and the weather makes its presence known, and truly becomes this formidable, almost sentient foe, earning the famous nickname, the Protestant Wind. Now, if you're familiar with world history, this idea that the weather can play an active role in the outcome of battles is nothing new. Take, for example, another divine wind, in fact, the divine wind, the kamikaze. So, just quickly, in the 13th century, a massive Mongol fleet, much like the Armada, was assembled by Kublai Khan in hopes of invading and conquering Japan. But, as fate would have it, a powerful storm developed and destroyed much of the Mongol fleet, sparing Japan. And this happened twice in a span of less than 10 years, thus becoming legend. It actually might be an interesting topic for a future episode. We'll see. Anyways, back to the Protestant wind. It was a disastrous journey home for the Spanish. Not only were their ships already damaged from all the fighting, but as you recall, many of them cut their anchors during the fireship attack. As the weather worsened, these damaged ships without their main anchors could not hold their positions against the gales. Many were simply driven into the jagged rocks and wrecked. It was catastrophic. Thousands drowned, and with their food and supplies gone, many more starved. Ultimately, only about half of the ships, about 60 or so, made it back to Spain. Only a third of the men returned. It was an absolutely devastating loss of men, material, and prestige for Spain. England, on the other hand, relished its glorious victory and basked in its divine providence.
God has delivered us from destruction. Let us thank him for our victory.
So, the Invincible Armada is defeated. End of story, right? Nope, not even close. While the battle itself was a pivotal event in history, what makes it significant is in the aftermath. Often presented as the turning point in Europe's long history, it signaled the end of Spain's dominance and ushered in the era of English supremacy. Well, it turns out that's only partially true. There's no doubt that the Armada's defeat was an enormous setback for Spain and Catholicism for that matter, but it wasn't the death blow that it's often made out to be. Spain continued to be a major player in Europe and the New World, with its expanding colonies in the Americas, but also in Asia with the colonization of the Philippines. These colonies continued to provide wealth and resources for Spain to rebuild its fleet and maintain its influence in the world. So Spain did not, in fact, collapse overnight. The greater and more profound impact would be felt by England. It marked the beginning of England's ascent as a major naval power and instilled in the island nation an unprecedented sense of national identity and pride. Led by a fiery queen with the heart of a king, and a king of England at that, the nation believed too it was in God's divine favor. This all paved the way for the growth of the British Empire. As far as religion, Catholicism was never able to gain a foothold and influence in England again. Protestantism became the de facto religion of the nation and soon spread to other parts of Europe and the world. So now let's play a fun game of what if. What if the Spanish Armada had succeeded? If Parma's troops had landed and invaded England, how dramatically different would the world be today? The implications are just staggering to contemplate. If Spain did manage to conquer England, England would most certainly have been re-Catholicized, by force. That would mean the abrupt end of the English Protestant Reformation, very likely followed by the widespread persecution of Protestants. Think the Spanish Inquisition. Elizabeth would most certainly have been deposed and or executed, marking the end of the English monarchy. Spain would have placed a Catholic on the throne, and their dominance in Europe would have expanded and lasted much, much longer. They might well have crushed Dutch and any resistance for that matter throughout Europe for centuries, which means no British Empire as we know it. Its vast global reach and influence just gone. That is very difficult to imagine. Early English colonies like Roanoke and Jamestown might never have been founded, or if they were, perhaps much later under very different circumstances, with Spanish, not English, being the dominant global language. The Protestant faith may well have been extinguished completely as well. Countries like the United States and Canada, and many others around the world, may never have come to be or at least followed completely different trajectories. The repercussions are actually quite mind-blowing. And furthermore, major intellectual and social movements, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and even the Industrial Revolution, which really flourished in Protestant nations like England and the Netherlands, they might have been significantly delayed or reshaped, perhaps even stifled under a stronger, more pervasive Catholic conservatism across Europe. How well do you think Isaac Newton would have been treated by the Catholic Church? Probably as well as his predecessors, Galileo and Copernicus. Even English literature, think Shakespeare, might have been suppressed or entirely different, maybe written in a world where England was effectively a Spanish province. I can go on. It's just staggering to think about how different the world would be. This one single event and its outcome fundamentally altered the trajectory of England and, by extension, the world. It's a story of audacious leadership on both sides, technical innovation, fatally flawed strategies, and the unpredictable, overwhelming power of nature. It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just a series of inevitable events marching forward in a straight line. It's this incredibly complex interplay of human agency, individual decisions, chance, luck, and sometimes quite literally, just the wind and the waves. That's your significance right there. I'm your host, Rome. Thank you for joining me on this, the inaugural episode of the Significantly Trivial podcast. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode. Was there anything that really stood out to you? Do you have any additional insight I might have missed? I'd love to hear about them. Hit me up in the comments or email me at significantlytrivialpodcast@gmail.com. Join me next time as I investigate the strange and paranormal with a pop culture phenomenon that took the world by storm. Interested? See you then.